I want to start. We have new people here. So what I do is I work as a muse. And so what I do as a muse is I work to inspire people in a traditional muse sense. So like the muses of Greek mythology, right? I work with businesses and I work with artists and musicians to work like a more traditional muse with the art of contagion. But in addition to that, I also teach people brain function so that they can activate the kind of brain function that stimulates inspiration, innovation. And so outside of traditional muse work, I teach people their brain function and how that affects our consciousness. So that's what we're going to talk about a bit tonight. I want to talk first about where I started in my journey to end up like where we are today. My initial diagnosis was chronic acute panic disorder complicated by severe depression. I was later revised to severe PTSD and addiction. And when I was initially diagnosed, I was diagnosed incurable. These conditions, PTSD and addiction, are still diagnosed incurable. Now, back when I was diagnosed, I was 23. Part of the diagnosis was that your brain is fully developed by the time you're in your early to mid 20s. And so whatever conditions you have are kind of just carved in stone at that point. Of course, we know a lot more about neuroplasticity now and understand that the brain is always changing. So that's not as much one of the defining factors. They understand what it means that the brain's done developing, but conditions like these aren't necessarily tied to that. However, the other two reasons that I was told my condition was incurable, they still, to this day, use as definitions for this condition being incurable, which is DNA is one. So this concept of bad wiring, or that the brain functions in a certain way. And when you're born with conditions like PTSD, addiction, autism, psychopathic brain, bipolar, all these things, that they are definitively brain wiring and that they can't be modified. Now medical science does recognize the concept that the body repairs things that it doesn't expect to repair, but they don't look at it as repeatable. So they can look at someone and say, yeah, there's this one person somewhere in this one place that, yeah, once cured that. But as a general rule, you can't, because we don't know how to do it. Right. So DNA is a strong fact. The other reason for me in my circumstance was experience. So for me in my DNA, in my family line, there are people that are psychopathic. And being raised around psychopathic people led to a lot of traumatic experiences. And so I was told that I would have, oh, that's okay. It made me remember I need to do this. Anyway, I was told I'd have night terrors my whole life. I was told that I would always have panic, that I would always have fear, that I would always have these states, and that the best I could do is create coping mechanisms to deal with them. And it's a concept that's still held pretty firm, that once you have a truly traumatic events in your life, that you never really can completely get over them. Concept. So that's where I started my journey. Where I am now is I'm completely cured. I don't have PTSD anymore. I don't have any addictive tendencies at all. And so tonight, what I want to talk about is how I did that and how the brain functioned, and really easy ways to be able to do that by taking that different approach, like you mentioned. So what we're going to talk about tonight is we're going to talk about the brain's relation to consciousness. We're going to talk about the effect that brain function has on us. So this is talking about how those chemicals affect us, where triggers really begin. We're going to learn what we can do to control them, and we're going to have time to do practices. Hopefully, I've modified the PowerPoint again, so hopefully we can we'll have a chance to get into practices and then live happier, healthier lives from it. So where I want to start with this is I want to start with where triggers really begin. So when we talk about this concept that what is really the point of initiation? So for different states of consciousness through different experiences of life, where does that really start? At what point does it begin? So where triggers begin is they start with sensory information. So we're talking sight, sound, taste, touch, smell. That combines with memory. And memory is pretty extensive. Memory isn't just the way we conceive of it. It's not just videos that play in our mind of something that happened to us once. It's just data that's stored. And so we have things that are primal data stored. It's just all the information that has been an experience in our lives or in the history of our DNA that the sensory information interacts with to make rules in our brain, right? And so those rules all have to do with survival mechanisms. And I'll get into that a bit tonight, the concept of survival mechanism. I get into it a lot more in more advanced classes. But when we have this sensory information come in combination with this memory, what it creates is a chemical trigger. So this is what we call a sensory trigger, right? And so what I'm going to talk about tonight is coming from this sensory trigger perspective that we understand. Psychology has a really deep understanding of sensory triggers and how they work. So we have the sensory trigger that happens. And basically what happens is we start with this sensory trigger, which then produces a chemical, like I said, which creates the state of consciousness. So again, whether it's depression, anger, lack of motivation, frustration, judgment, fear, whatever experience, whatever state of consciousness you would consider to be an experience of reality, it is the result of that chemical. Like we said, if you feel stressed, stress isn't causing the chemical reaction. The chemical reaction is causing stress, right? And everybody's going to have different chemical reactions in different situations. A single situation is not going to be stressful to everyone, right? That situation is going to depend on that memory of sensory information coming together, which then that creates our life experience. That creates what we perceive as our reality, right? And so what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to break this down and understand brain function according to 4 different states of consciousness. We're really going to talk mostly about 2 and a little bit into the 3rd state of consciousness. But what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the state of consciousness that's a suffering state or what the brain perceives as a dying state. We're going to talk about a relief of that suffering state, which is a surviving state. So I'm not dying in this moment. I'm going to survive. I'm going to live to see another day. And we're going to talk about thriving states. And then another state of consciousness we get into in these processes is a striving state. We won't dig into that much tonight. That's going to come next week. We'll talk a little bit more about thriving and striving. We're going to work mostly tonight in the first 2 states and a little bit into the 3rd. So we're going to start with understanding the state of suffering. So what the state of suffering is for us is a primal mechanism in the brain. So these early stages, the first 2 are really based off of what our brain does as a primate brain. So primal brains work in a certain specific way. And so when we go back to this concept of sensory triggers and how they work in a primal state, the sensory trigger that we're dealing with initially for states of suffering is a threat of death. Now, it doesn't have to be a real threat of death. It's just a perceived threat of death. Now, this is where this is a piece that becomes really important to understand in the fact that primates, 2 major survival mechanisms are safety and familiarity and having a tribe, right? Primate, so a human child born can't survive on its own. Right? If you put a 3-year-old in the woods by themselves, they're probably going to die. So one of the base primal mechanisms is I have to have a tribe. If I don't have a tribe, if I don't fit in, I'll die. And that our brain is just pretty much processing and shedding neurons the first 9 years of our life based off of that, based off what it needs to survive. So not having a tribe, not having fitting in somewhere becomes a threat of death. Also familiarity. If things aren't familiar, change. If the rules change or if something unfamiliar comes, it also becomes a threat of death. So again, these are perceived threats of death. However, how the brain processes them is the same as true threats of death. So as far as your brain knows, if you have one of these threats, this threat of change or threat of loss, you're being chased by a tiger. That's as far as the brain knows. There's no difference between that and being chased by a tiger. So in a primal model, in a social survival model, which is what primates live in, this becomes, if you don't have the right house, the right car, the right kind of relationship, the right kind of job, the right amount of income, the right this, you're not going to fit in. You're not going to survive. Right. And so we end up with a whole list of potential threats of death. Now, the chemical that's released in this threat, I'm not going to do the chemical first. I changed this order today, so I might trip up in a couple places. So basically, we're going to talk about this threat state first. So when we're under threat, this perceived threat, what's happening, what the body does in this circumstance is, at a physical level, the first thing we have is we have an enlarged amygdala. So what happens is this. The amygdala is our emotional memory. And it is the part of the brain that triggers under threat of death. So the minute we're being threatened at all, the amygdala triggers. Now, what happens is if we live in a state where there are a lot of triggers that create low-level stress or maybe create PTSD, what happens is the amygdala becomes enlarged. So it becomes hypersensitive. What it does is it becomes overreactive to a fight or flight response. It starts to see threat more often in more things, right? It doesn't have that base security. And so what happens is the brain chemical that's released in this scenario, when we trigger that amygdala, is excess norepinephrine. Okay, so norepinephrine is a chemical we all produce. It's what makes us awake. So the fact that we're all in this room awake right now means we're all producing some level of norepinephrine. It makes us awake, alert, and focused. However, there's a certain amount of norepinephrine that's stored in the synaptic vesicles for release in fight or flight scenario. And that release is what the amygdala does. So now what we have is this excess norepinephrine being released, right? It's not the normal amount. It's a tiger's chasing me, so I have to be hyper alert. I have to be hyper awake, right? The other two chemicals that are released are epinephrine and histamine. Now, epinephrine is basically the fight or flight response that we all get, that we all understand, which is adrenaline, right? We all get that our heart races and our blood pressure increases and our breath quickens and stuff when we're in fight or flight reactions. And most people relate this state to fight or flight, but don't understand that fight or flight is about a lot more than that state. The other aspect is the aspect I want to get more into, which is what histamines do when we enter this state. So histamines are communication. So what's happening is this is communicating with the body systems and telling the body systems what to do. And so what histamine does in an overactive fight or flight state, so when we trigger fight or flight, we are consuming a tremendous amount of energy. So the body has so much energy it has to use. And now we've just made ourselves hyper awake, hyper alert, plus we've released all this adrenaline that's increasing our heart rate, constricting our blood vessels, sending all this sugar to our system. So all of a sudden the body's in really high energy consumption, right? So you can relate it to thinking of running. You can only run for so long, right? Because it consumes a tremendous amount of energy. Well, what's happening is the brain knows that this is consuming a lot of energy. So what it does is it starts to shut down systems to conserve energy. So it shuts down the systems it doesn't think it needs during a fight or flight response to conserve energy in the body. So I want to talk about those systems that are being shut down and the four major histamines that we know about now. Histamines are being discovered all the time. This is why we're seeing huge advances in pharmacology, because even the last two histamines I'm going to talk about were only discovered in 2008 and 2015, I think are the right dates. So they're really recent discoveries. The first histamine most of us know about, which is allergic response, right? You take an antihistamine for seasonal allergies, right? So what's happening is the brain is saying, well, I don't have to worry about allergies right now because a tiger is chasing me, right? So I don't need this system. In addition to having the histamine listed, I'm also listing where that histamine is stored. I'm only doing this for people with specific medical conditions. They know what that means. If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. You don't need to. Be glad you don't know, because then you're just so sick you know way too much about the anatomy. But this is where those are stored. And so one of the systems that's being shut down is allergic reaction. That's the H1 histamine. The H2 histamine is the GI tract. So acid secretion, right? You hear about fight or flight or rest and digest. I'm going to talk about rest and digest in a minute. But basically the digestive system is being shut down when we're being chased by a tiger. We don't need that working when we're being chased by a tiger. Plus, the digestive system uses a tremendous amount of energy. So the body's like, okay, let's shut that down because I need this energy. Also, neurotransmitter control is another system that's shut down. So this is our central nervous system. So this is the concept that if I'm running from a tiger and trees, like I'm running through the forest and trees are scraping me or I'm stubbing my toe, I don't want to have to feel that right now. I need my attention on getting away from the tiger. This is really evident a lot in like car accidents. Most people, when they have a car accident, won't feel it for a couple days, right? Because shock, which is the body shutting down all those systems, prevents us from, the injury happened, the pain is there, but the body shuts it down so we don't feel it, right? And so this is what happens over time is if we have the system shut down, a lot of people tend to not have a lot of, not as much feeling in their body, not as aware of pain because the body's shutting down that communication from the central nervous system to the brain. And the other one that's the most recent discovery is H4, which is the immune response. So, of course, we don't need to worry about having a strong immune system again when a tiger's chasing us, right? And so what this creates over time, so you have to think of it this way. If I'm a person that's stressed all the time or depressed or have any of these systems, these fight or flight symptoms, which is any state of suffering, literally any state of suffering, pain, fear, depression, lack of motivation, judgment, isolation, any of these things, if I'm in that state a lot, I have to know that whenever I'm in that state, my systems are shut down. So over time, the shutting down and turning on of systems too much is causing this histamine imbalance. And so what pharmacology has discovered that symptoms and conditions that are the result of histamine imbalance in the body include, but are not just subject to, weight disorders, food disorders, GI disorders, anaphylaxis, nutrient deficiencies, allergic response, ulcers, leaky gut, motion sickness, seizure disorders, cancer, autism, autoimmune disease, neurological diseases, hormone imbalances, mood disorders, sleep-wake disorders, cognitive function disorders, skin disorders, blood vessel dilation, body pain or fibromyalgia, respiratory disorders, asthma, and bacterial infestations. Nearly every illness known to man is the byproduct of a histamine imbalance caused by an overactive fight or flight response, right? This is what makes us sick. So basically what's happening is at this physical level when in fight or flight, with this enlarged amygdala, again, we have this overactive fight or flight response and it's shutting down systems in the body, which is causing pain and sickness. So it's not only the way we experience reality and the mood we're in, where literally illness is caused by this overactive fight or flight response. And we are in a dying state. It's no longer the fact that we think we're dying. It's not just perceived threat of death. We are actually threatening death because we are interfering with the body's ability to be in a healthy state. What happens at a mental level is we feel powerless. So these are the situations where we feel like we have no ability to impact what's happening in the world. So we have no control. We feel subject to conditions. We might experience depression, anxiety, stress, have conditions like PTSD, addiction, or mental illness. At an emotional level, we feel vulnerable. And I really like for people to know what the word vulnerable really means. Because we tend to talk about vulnerable like it's being open and authentic, which it's not. Vulnerable means at risk, right? When we're vulnerable, we're at risk of something. And we feel that risk state. We feel not safe, right? So we might experience anger, sadness, fear. Any overreactive emotional state is the amygdala. So when we're reactive, emotionally reactive, it's the amygdala. It just means our amygdala is enlarged. We're not wrong. It's not our fault. It's just a physical condition of the body. We'll feel pain, insecurity, lack of motivation. We'll feel expendable and alone. So this is what the body's doing when we're in that fight or flight response. This is the experience we're having. So again, we have this threat of death. We're releasing norepinephrine, epinephrine, and histamine, which is creating a fight or flight response, which is creating our suffering, right? Our suffering isn't causing the fight or flight response to happen. The fight or flight response is creating our suffering. And fight or flight is a lot more extensive than we realize. It can be something, it can be such subtle things. I'm just in a bad mood today. I mean, it's really at that level. That's just a lesser fight or flight response than I'm having a full-blown panic attack. But I'm still in a fight or flight response and systems are still shutting down. So what we do in the Inspired Evolution Project is in phase 1, our goal is to relieve that suffering, to pull ourselves out of that state initially. And so what I want to do is I want to talk about what that means. So we're in this suffering state where we're dying. We're both think we're dying, and we are physically getting enough damage to the body that it can kill us. We're releasing too much norepinephrine, epinephrine, and histamine, and we're having this fight or flight response. What we're wanting to do is move out of that state into a state where we feel safe and well, right? Where we're surviving. Right. So my initial state of consciousness when I'm dealing with phase 1 is that I'm in this fight or flight state, and I'm trying to move out of that. These are both primal states. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. But what I want to talk about first are phase 1 practices. I was hoping, I ordered a bunch of the practices book. I have a new book I've released, and it's called The Practices. And
got it today.
Oh, did you get yours today? Yeah. Cool. But it has a list of these practices in it. But I'm just going to review really quick the phase 1 practices. And our goal in these practices is basically just to relieve the suffering. We're just trying to take enough of the edge off that we feel safe again, because there's something happening in the brain. So anytime we're in a state where we're anxious or fearful or angry or sad, it just means we don't feel safe. Something has threatened our safety, whether, again, it's threatening our tribe or familiarity. Something in the brain says, I'm not safe. Now, the connections the brain makes, it has its reasons for making them. But trying to analyze that is nearly impossible. I'm going to talk about why in a minute. But so all we want to do at this point is ease our suffering. Now, most of us have mechanisms we know of already in how to do this. These are traditional coping mechanisms we can learn in therapy. It's also stuff we've done all along to make ourselves feel more comfortable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a list of the ones I recommend. And then in addition to that, or not in addition necessarily, what I recommend you do is as you're listening, figure out the ones that resonate with you and just write those down. So these are the things we want to go to when we're in that more agitated, stressed, or depressed state. So the first thing I recommend is positive sensory trigger. So if we go back and we remember, okay, well, it's sensory information plus memory that causes a chemical reaction. If I've had a chemical reaction of norepinephrine, I can also create a chemical reaction of feeling safe, right? To turn off that excess norepinephrine. And so positive sensory stimuli is a really easy way to do this. So think of the senses, sight, sound, taste, touch, smell, and creating a positive stimulus with that in any one of those. So for example, sound could be putting on music that's soothing, right? Or it could be listening to an app that has this sound of like ocean waves or birds chirping, right? Now, we're not looking for anything necessarily make us happy and on top of the world at this point. We're just trying to not be in a high suffering state. So we're just kind of trying to take the edge off of the suffering at this point. So other senses you can use are scent. You know, you can light a candle you like the smell of. Some people use essential oils or incense. You can do touch, self-soothing behavior, physical touch by caressing your own skin or having a pillow or something that's really soft to touch, something that's soothing. You can do sight. A lot of people will have things like certain things like maybe pictures of the ocean or certain visual memories that help us feel comforted and soothed. Taste. I recommend healthy food here. This can, I'm going to talk a little bit about why we'll go to unhealthy foods and such, but like a cup of tea, a warm cup of tea, or the taste of something that makes us feel better. But again, I recommend staying on the healthy side with that. The other thing we can do is, so one of the things primates developed, because primates are the weakest of all predators, one of the things primates developed is this analytical thinking brain. And we did this for survival, in the fact that if I'm a monkey in a tree and there's a leopard, I might figure out that if I throw something at the leopard that it's going to go away. And so thinking through things like that really helps us. So advancing thinking can be very helpful in the state. Now the issue is that the prefrontal cortex shuts down when we're in a state of fight or flight. So we really only have access to stuff we already know really well. And a lot of times, if it's a really, really bad trigger, like a full-blown panic attack, we may only have access to early developmental learning. So for example, I had a panic attack once when I had PTSD that was so bad, I couldn't read. I was trying to do some work, and the only letter I could recognize was the lowercase letter R. Why? I don't know. Maybe that's the first one I learned, but or registered or solidified or something. But sometimes they're so bad that we can't. So we do really want to go back to really early learning. So a couple things I recommend to do this is doing the alphabet backwards, because we learn the alphabet at a young age. And so doing it backwards, though, oftentimes we don't know that. Another is counting exercises, but you want to make them increasingly difficult. So like one of my favorites is counting sums. 1 + 1 is 2, 2 + 2 is 4, 4 and 4 is 8, 16, 32. Because within a very short amount of time, you're in the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands trying to remember all the numbers and add them at the same time in your head. So it's an advanced learning thing. So it takes you from this early state of 1 + 1 = 2 to an advanced state, which pulls you out of that fight or flight response, because now you're using the primal mechanism of thinking, right? This is why a lot of times when bad things happen, we're like, if I could just understand why, I'd be okay. Because if I can understand why, then I feel safe, because that's how the monkey mind works, right? So thinking practices like that. Another thing you can do is like add random numbers, like do math by eights, or do multiplication tables and start with the easy ones first. In addition to that, things I recommend are things like reading. If you do reading, only recreational reading. You don't want difficult reading here. So I'm talking like Harry Potter, or doing audio books is a good thing to do here. Distractions are good. It can be things like TV or movies. It could be puzzles. Puzzles are really good. You just want them to be things that are easy, that you're good at. There's one that's like a puzzle that I'm going to talk about, which is basically coloring. So these, there so people can see, these coloring books are really, I mean, that's why you can see it says calming therapy, anti-stress coloring book, right? That's the point of these. I do give rules for coloring. And that is, if we look, I recommend, so first of all, you want to completely fill in each space and try and stay within the line. So you can see by this one that the person kind of vaguely colored it in. This is more about rushing to the end. So that's the other thing, is don't worry about getting it done fast, and don't worry about how good it looks. The exercise is in trying to stay within the lines and completely fill the space. And that's what soothes the brain. So filling in a predetermined space. Other ways to do this: jigsaw puzzles, paint by numbers. And these are available in both apps on your phone and in physical books and stuff like these. But it's very soothing to the brain because what it does is it shifts your focus out of the cycling in the brain and onto something external. And the brain says, oh, well, I must be okay. Another one that is more biologically driven is lying on the floor. What happens is that when we're under a state of too much duress, the brain causes us to pass out. It buckles our knees and it puts us on the floor. So it understands through spatial recognition that if we're on the floor, it needs to start going into a recovery process. And so that's why we pass out when, like, if we hold our breath too long or something, it will cause us to pass out because the brain says, no, I need to go into recovery mode. Something bad is happening. And so lying on the floor will immediately start to make us feel better. It's a really good mechanism. Being on a couch or a bed will not work. The brain processes that differently. If you're on a third-story building and lay on the floor of an apartment, it still works because your brain conceives of that as the floor. Also, you can lay on the grass or something like that. I think that's most of them that I can think of right now. If you want a whole list and have really heightened states of fight or flight, for example, things like PTSD, depression, anxiety, panic, any types of anxiety, social, if you have severe physical conditions, I do recommend that Practices book. It goes through a whole process of really coming to understand the way the brain functions and really mastering that first stage of being able, because we do have to pull ourselves out of these triggered states to be able to accomplish anything, right? And so otherwise, that's a pretty good list. And I'm sure at some point I'll have those listed somewhere too. I should have them listed somewhere that's not in the books. I think I'm going to have to work on that. So anyway, so that's what we do for phase one. And phase one really is just to relieve the suffering, just to take the edge off the worst of it. So that's the suffering state. And again, what we're moving into when we do that practice is we now want to move into the state that's not suffering anymore. So we're moving out of this state of threat and into this non-threatened, non-dying state, right? So I'm not dying right now. And the chemical we release to do this is serotonin. And this neurotransmitter is what I always call serotonin, the I'm not dying chemical. And for some of us, this is kind of the best we feel. And I'm not dying feels a lot better than dying, right? Absolutely.
So going through phase one, when do you know that you've gone through phase enough successfully enough to move on to phase two? Like, is it when you can get yourself quickly out of that state, that feeling of, flight, or how do you know when you've mastered phase one?
So one of the things I do is kind of, for a lot of people, phase one and phase two kind of work together, because phase two is about breaking primal patterns. But if a person is experiencing high agitated states, I suggest they stay in phase one. So basically the way we know is, one of the things we're doing in phase one is we're coming to understand that experience of life is byproduct of a chemical. So once a person gets that, they can move forward, right? Even if they have a lot of triggered states. Because I don't necessarily want to see people get into using this as a drug, right? I don't want to just get into relieving suffering. We want something more than that out of life, right? But if a person is in such high states of suffering, if their triggered states are so high, to try and move forward without mastering being able to get out of that feels impossible. And it kind of revalidates the suffering as a state that we can't control. So if a person has like severe PTSD and they are trying to do phase two, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, if they can't get into the state where they calm the systems enough to do phase two, they won't be able to do it. And so that failure at phase two may convince them that they can never be out of phase one. So one of the things I do recommend is to try phase two practices all through phase one, and to just realize if they're not working, it's just because phase one, that you might be in a highly agitated state. The primary focus that I'll recommend is phase 2. That's where we want to put, because that's where we're changing the game, so to speak, right? But we do have to be able to get ourselves into a calm enough state to do phase 2. So a lot of it can be measured by how well can I do phase 2? And that should improve quickly. A person should not be, even a person with severe PTSD or something like that, should not be stuck in just phase 1 for more than a week or 2 at the most, if they're doing practices every day. And this is what you'll hear me say over and over again. Do practices every day. Those are the people that are successful in this. The people that do them sporadically here and there, they'll have growth, but they won't have the off-the-chart success of people who are willing to do their practices every day. So I just say, keep trying. One of the things I do recommend is try phase 2, which I'll go through those practices in a minute. But try phase 2, and if you can't do it, go back and do a phase 1 practice and then try again. Yeah. And you'll see the difference, how easy it is to bounce between the two. For phase 1 and 2 really do work a lot together. Phase 3 and 4 do the same thing, where they work off of each other well. So in this serotonin, now one of the mistakes we do with serotonin is we tend to think it's a feel-good chemical, and that is because not dying does feel better than dying. So when I first started my process, I was triggered probably 90% of the time. I was in a state of suffering probably 90% of the time. I had serotonin about 10%. Thriving, I had no idea what that even meant. So I felt like that serotonin state was kind of the best it could get, kind of. And it is in a primal model. So again, we have primates operate in one of 2 states, fight or flight or rest and digest, which is what serotonin is. Serotonin is released through the digestive system, and it means I'm safe. That tiger is not chasing me at the moment, right? Whatever my tiger is. So again, when I'm in a non-threatened state, I'm releasing serotonin, which puts me to rest and digest, right? So my digestive system kicks back on, my immune system, my allergic response system, my central nervous system, to the extent it can, depending on how much time, again, I'm in that fight or flight. And I feel safe and well, right? So what happens when we enter rest and digest state in the brain, what the body's doing in comparison to fight or flight, at a physical level, we still have an enlarged amygdala. This doesn't change the size of our amygdala. This is these temporary respites, so to speak. So I'm still subject to a fight or flight response. I'm just not in one at the moment, right? So my systems are on, but they're not at peak performance because they may be bouncing on and off. There may be some instability in the communication with the histamines at this point. We might be just waiting for that other shoe to drop, right? So we're kind of more on edge. Because of the heightened states of fight or flight, we're in this state where we're kind of waiting for something bad to happen. So we're never really fully resting. And we become dependent on the practice, right? So whatever pulls us out of the fight or flight state, we are dependent on that. And I want to talk about this, understanding dependency and addictive cycles, because I think the way it's presented is grossly misunderstood by the lion's share of systems out there. So again, we have this sensory trigger that happens, right? So we have sensory information that combines with memory that causes a sensory trigger. That sensory trigger causes us to go into a fight or flight state, which is a high state of suffering. We're not happy when we're angry or sad or anxious. It doesn't feel good. We're in these high suffering states. So what we do is we try to relieve that suffering. Now, a lot of systems will call this a reward model. It's not really so much for humans anymore, and I'm going to get into that a little bit. What we're really doing is a self-medication process. Most advanced medical practices do not call addiction cycles just reward-based models anymore. They call them self-medication, because self-medication means what addiction really is I'm not looking for reward. What I'm doing is I am suffering so much right now that I just need relief for a minute. I just need to pull myself out of this fight or flight state for a minute. The problem is it's temporary, because now I'm dependent on the system that pulled me out of fight or flight. Now, whether that's drugs and alcohol, whether that's shopping addiction, whether that's television, whether that's video games, or whatever the system is that's pulling me out, it's temporary. So for example, if I have food addiction, say I have the sensory trigger of I get fired from my job, and my sensory information says, well, now I'm under threat of death, right? I'm going to not be able to get another job. I'm going to lose my house, my whatever. I'm going to be on the streets. I'm going to die. This is a high suffering state. I'm afraid. So I might stop on my way home and get some chocolate cake, because that's my addiction. Now, it's going to make me feel better until the cake is gone. And then what's going to happen is I'm going to go back into that sensory trigger. I'm going to go back into a high state of suffering. I'm going to have to relieve that suffering, and it becomes this cyclic motion. Now, this is a dependency addiction model that is based strictly off fight or flight and rest and digest, because those are the mechanisms that are working when we're in this. So we're in this high state of suffering. We need to relieve the suffering. So we're releasing serotonin. The systems are turning on, but they're not peak. And we're in this comfort zone, which in that sense looks like a reward-based model. But this whole concept of dopamine and reward, humans don't function there anymore. That makes sense for an animal. That makes sense for my dog, because I can train him off a reward-based model. And so we become dependent on the thing that's relieving our suffering. And that's what addiction is the thing that at some point in our life relieved our suffering. So we become dependent on that practice. So what's happening at a mental level is we are still in a primal model now. We're in a level of primal homeostasis. And so we're still subject to external threat, right? So we are in that state where we need to we've relieved the suffering. We feel secure and placated. But, and we can use the thinking analytical mind now, right? So once I'm out of that triggered state, I can analyze and think. The problem is the limitations of that. And what's happening at an emotional level is we're still subject to safety and familiarity. If anything changes, we just trigger again, right? So we have our comfort zone, anything that threatens our comfort zone. So anything that threatens familiarity, if we're subject to change, or if anything happens with our tribe. If someone dies or leaves us, the end of a relationship, the end of a job, the end of things that all affect our tribe, people that have crisis of faith, anything like that, all of a sudden becomes this fight or flight trigger. And then we need whatever we're dependent on to pull us out back into that rest and digest state. And so we're just surviving. This is living life surviving instead of in a thriving state. So basically in phase one, what we're doing is we're learning how to consciously be able to move out of suffering and into rest and digest. But if we're in either of these two, we're still bound by primal mechanisms, right? And what we need to do, because here's the issue, even healthy rest and digest, even coloring in the coloring book, even counting, even sensory stimuli that's positive, even healthy rest and digest mechanisms keep us in dependency. Because what do I do if I don't have my coloring book? What do I do if I can't do the alphabet backwards? What do I do if I don't have my chocolate cake, right? I'm still dependent on the rest and digest mechanism to keep me safe. So we need to ask, what does it mean to break the cycle? And I want to go back to sensory triggers when I talk about this, because this is where we're starting to step into phase two. And I want to talk about that. And the fact that we now want to break this cycle, this fight or flight, rest and digest cycle. Now, if we trigger in fight or flight, we still need to get ourselves into rest and digest to move into more advanced brain function. But the ultimate goal of this work is to evolve brain function. So to break out of primal mechanisms completely and use the human brain to the full capability of the human brain. So if we go back to the sensory trigger and what's initiating that whole fight or flight response in the first place, what we want to start doing is moving ourselves into a thriving state. We want to now trigger what's thriving, where we're beyond dying and beyond surviving and living in a thriving state. This is dopamine, right? So dopamine, again, is not a feel-good chemical. It's also, I think a reward chemical is wrong, and even calling a pleasure chemical. Now, it's true, when we release dopamine, we feel good. It feels pleasurable. But what dopamine is doing is it's putting us back into human homeostasis. And what it really is a success chemical. Dopamine is the chemical that says, I'm successful as a human being. I'm successful and I'm valuable. And this is what creates that thriving state, right? So when we're in the thriving state, dopamine's released, we feel successful and valuable. Now, the interesting thing about dopamine is it's a self-motivating chemical. So we feel successful and valuable, which then causes us to produce more dopamine, right? And I'm going to talk about how we use this. Now, how do I use brain function to cause this? And so what I want to do is I want to break it down to where origination has to happen. And I want to do this by kind of working backwards in this, in the way that I have the PowerPoint laid out. So most of the time, what we're trying to do to create a thriving state from either a dying or just surviving state is we try to change life experiences, right? If I could just find a better job, or if I could just find that good relationship, or if I could just have enough money, right? We think if we fix life experience, it will affect the way the chemicals work. And again, like we talked about from the beginning, the life experience is the byproduct of the chemical. And so can you make difference there? Yes. But it is arduous and it is incremental. So for example, if my life experience is I don't have good boundaries, I can work 8 to 10 hours a day, every day for the rest of my life on my boundaries, and I will see improvement. But I will get nominal results. I will work really hard for little bits of growth, right? And so that approach is possible. Yes, I can improve it. If I'm a negative person, I can try and think positively to change my brain structure. And will it work over time? Yeah. There are a lot of meditators that meditated for 30 years and over the course of 30 years have changed. Usually nominally in comparison to the fact that it was 30 years, right? They might be really centered and grounded now where they were a hot mess, but it took 30 years. 30 years is a very long time to get somewhere and focus on something every day, right? And this is why a lot of people that like try things like meditation struggle, because we're approaching meditation from the life experience perspective. That's why my approach to meditation is change your brain function and you'll go into a meditative state. Because meditation is also a result of brain function, right? So we don't want to approach life experience. Can you? Yes. Are there programs out there to do that? Yes. Do I do those? No, I don't. No process driven. So another way we try to approach it is state of consciousness. Let's change our state of consciousness. But again, that state of consciousness is subject to the same limitations. Now, is it going to get you there a little faster? Yes. Than trying to change your life experience. So trying to approach having a better state of consciousness, reading self-help books, going through challenging our confirmation biases, it's going to work faster than changing jobs to get result, but it's still going to be arduous and incremental. So what we really want to do is change the chemical, right? I want to be in dopamine. I don't want to have excess norepinephrine. I want to be in dopamine, and I want to have healthy, balanced brain chemistry. And so what I really need to return to is the sensory trigger that's driving the chemical in the first place, right? So then we go back to where triggers begin, because this is where we have to go, is into the brain function of the trigger. So we know we can't control the chemical by just controlling the chemical. I mean, there are ways we can. I'm going to talk about that for about a blip. But the other two things are what's driving the chemical. Sensory information and memory. Now, sensory information, we can't really control that. People try, right? People with social anxiety don't go into large crowds. They're controlling the sensory information, but they're living a very limited life through that control of sensory information, right? We may say, Well, I don't like the heat. The heat makes me trigger, so I'm not going to go outside in the summer, right? Or I'm going to become overwhelmed when I do. The heat's going to be too much, right? So we can to that extent. Now, the problem though with doing sensory information is the way the brain relates sensory information to triggers. So when the brain experiences trauma or has any rules from primal mechanisms that say these are threats, it doesn't measure the trauma. It measures the moment before the trauma. So if somebody grabs my arm and then viciously attacks me, my brain won't remember the attack necessarily because it's shutting down the prefrontal cortex. What it's going to do is it's going to remember that my arm was grabbed. So then anytime anybody grabs my arm, I'm going to go into a fight or flight response because the brain is trying to predict and prevent the trauma. So I could be listening to a song, or I could be having a really great day and get blindsided by something. Or there could be a certain temperature that's happening, or a certain smell, the smell of a certain flower, right? So our sensory triggers are actually based off of everyday occurrences. That's why there's so many clients I work with that are like, why is it when I'm having a really good day that I have this anxiety that some other shoe is going to drop? I'm like, well, because one day you were having a really good day and some shoe dropped. And your brain stored that information and said, now every time I'm having a really good day, something bad is about to happen, right? So trying to approach the sensory level is nearly impossible. So what we really want to look at is the concept of memory. And this is where all of the most successful mechanisms are working. And I want to talk about what's available. So what can we do to start controlling the interaction between sensory information and memory, right? Because that's where the real issue is. Current existing options to manage your chemicals by managing memory. Therapeutic treatment is of course, most popular and can be really successful. So what a therapist is going to do is help you change your relationship with the memory, right? And a lot of this has to do with peeling the onion and going back to when it happened and telling the brain you can make a different decision, right? And what you're doing is using the new information of the therapist to be able to change the confirmation bias your brain has around the memory. It does work. Takes a long time. And in conditions like mine, severe PTSD, there was no way I could have, in the course of a normal life, processed enough information to cure PTSD. And this is one of the problems and one of the reasons why it's diagnosed incurable is because it would have taken me hundreds of years to process all those memories of all the traumas that happened to me. So it does work. It is a good option, especially for beginning if a person has really severe states to be stabilized, but therapeutic treatment, and I'm not just talking psychology, right? All therapeutic treatment, anything process driven. This can be NLP. This can be a lot of therapies, things like acupuncture, things like, anything that has a process to it is therapeutic, right? You're using the therapy to change the chemistry, right? Second option is pharmaceuticals. Works a lot faster. However, you cannot create the same homeostasis exogenously that you can create endogenously. So what this means is, for example, I can take something that triggers the release of serotonin in my system. The problem is this. My body, to create serotonin, includes the digestive system. It includes the pancreas, the adrenal system. There's a lot of different systems involved in the body in producing serotonin. So now when I take a drug that causes the release of serotonin, my body is constantly measuring its own homeostasis. And it's saying, oh, I don't have to make serotonin anymore. So all these systems that make serotonin are no longer being used to make serotonin. And so it's causing side effects. And this is why people end up on pharmaceutical cocktails, because this pharmaceutical is causing the histamine to work that is trying to turn off the system because the brain is saying, I need to conserve energy. And so because it's forcing the system to turn on, there's these other systems that are being affected. So now I've got to take a pill for that and a pill for that. And it's this constant negotiation with a doctor of trying to create something that feels like a manageable life, which often still has side effects suffering to it, right? Plus, we are now subject to the pharmaceutical. and what it's doing. So pharmaceuticals will work faster. If a person is depressed, it'll take years of therapy, but a pharmaceutical may be able to make them feel better in a few weeks. But again, it's going to have its side effects. The other option is actually placebo effect. Now, most people think of placebo effect as sugar pills. That is wrong. Placebo effect means to cause the body to release a chemical through an action of some kind, right? Now, sugar pills are actually not the most common or the most successful placebo effect in humans. Other human contact is the most effective placebo effect. So, for example, acupuncture. It works for a lot of people, not everyone, but neuroscience has done study on acupuncture for years, and they found, yes, it works. It works on a lot of people. However, where you place the needle does not matter on whether it works or not. It's human contact that's causing it to work. This is why energy healers work for some people. This is why, because human contact is a huge placebo effect. The problem is it's unpredictable. Will acupuncture work for me or not? I've had acupuncture after a car accident, worked phenomenally. It was the first thing that got me out of pain, right? It only worked temporarily. I had to keep going back, but it caused the placebo effect that relieved pain that nothing else was working on, not even pharmaceuticals. So it can be really powerful, but will it work for me, and which one will work and which one won't? It's inconsistent in its results. So what we do in IEP practices is placebo effect that has predictable results. So it's understanding the brain function that causes these chemicals to release. So what brain function causes serotonin to release? We just talked about those in the phase 1 practices, right? What chemical causes dopamine to release? So that's what we want to do in the practices, realize what brain function causes the release of the chemicals so I can have a predictable result, a predictable outcome. So again, in phase 1, what we're doing is the primary focus of phase 1 is understanding that everything we experience as reality is byproduct of chemical. And I mean this to the most extreme state. If someone dies and you're sad, it's a chemical. If you get attacked and you're angry, it's a chemical. No emotion is inherent to any action. Right? They feel inherent because the amygdala is implicit emotion. It is reaction according to training. So it's a system that's set up in your DNA that's both adopted through family and then trained through experience. So it happens so automatically that you think it's implicit, but it is subject to the brain function of triggering the amygdala. So phase 1 is really about understanding that no matter how I feel in any situation, I can feel differently by triggering a different chemical. Now we understand this pharmaceutically, right? People have depression, they take pharmaceuticals and the depression goes away, right? So we understand chemical can affect us, but we have to understand this at every level of our existence. So phase 1 is about that. The second part of it is to be able to enter and maintain a rest and digest state at will. No matter how bad I'm triggered, no matter how intense it is. If I get kidnapped by terrorists, I should be able to take myself out of a fight or flight state, because humans are not adept at fight or flight. There is no point where it helps us excel or survive, because we are too weak and conditioned. So we are not strong enough or fast enough to have fight or flight be of benefit to us. So the other part of phase 1 is learning to break the cycle, which is about implementing phase 2 so that we can start creating human homeostasis and reducing that amygdala. So what happens, so these are phase 2 practices. So I want to go through those now. So I'm going to give you a list of phase 2 practices. Again, there's a long list of these in the book. And that practices book really takes you through phase 1 and 2. It's just a systematic pattern of that. So I'm really excited about it. I'm really excited about the system I came up with, because I think within a month it takes you through this process of being all the way through phase 2 and into phase 3. So phase 2 practices. What we're doing in phase 2 is we're stimulating the prefrontal cortex. So this is really a common understanding now that humans, it's about becoming more centered, more grounded in where we are. So practices that do this, mindfulness practices, right? So anything about bringing our focus into the moment and into an observational state. So true mindfulness is just being in a state of observation. So I could be observing my breath. I could be, doing deep breaths and observing my breath. I could be observing a candle flame flickering. I could be observing my body. So one of the ones I recommend a lot is a body scan, to just become aware of your body, like starting at your toes and saying, okay, I'm aware of my toes, and going through and being aware of each toe, pat of the toe, the toenail, and then being aware of the arch of the foot, each foot, being aware of the heel, the ball of the foot, just systematically going through the body. By the time you're done doing that, you're pretty centered and grounded. Other things, learning something new. So any learning process is stimulating the prefrontal cortex, because that's how we learn. So it can be learning a new language. I say even learning something fun, learning how to juggle, learning a certain dance or something like that. Anytime we're learning something new, we're in an observational state. Going someplace new. This is why vacations make us feel good, because any time we go someplace unfamiliar, it stimulates the prefrontal cortex, because we now have to be in an observational state to create safety for ourselves. So some of the things I suggest are just looking up online weird things in my city, or one of the things I've done, because I love nature, is just done a Google map and then looked for any green spots and zoomed into them. And I found a bunch of parks I didn't know about that were really great nature things. Geocaching. I totally recommend geocaching. You spell it GEOCACHING. Geocaching is they give you GPS coordinates, and you have to go find those, and then you have to find like a box or a rock or something. And then it's really cool because it hits 3 major functions of healthy brain activity. Probably might even hit all 4 actually, but one of them is community, because when you get there, there's a book that everyone that's been there has signed, and so you're kind of connecting with a community of geocachers. Plus, there's a little concept of trinkets and leave one, take one. So people have left things there, and you can take one and leave some of your own. And then also, because you're having to find a new location, find something new, which is stimulating the brain. The other healthy part is exercise. And so a lot of times you have to hike to places for geocaching and stuff. So it will increase circulation. So that's going somewhere new. The other thing is, if you're doing something like reading, this is where you want to do more advanced reading. So you might want to read philosophy or educational books, something that you have to labor at reading. I also recommend the classics. So sometimes reading the classics can be really difficult just because the language changes. So the harder it is to read, the better it is for your brain. But you can't do that when you're triggered, right? Because again, you only have early learning. So you have to calm yourself down first, maybe listening to a book on tape, and then go into reading something more complex. Music here should be music that makes you want to dance and sing, right? These both require the prefrontal cortex to be able to do those things. And so one of the examples I'll use is the fact that when I'm in phase 1, I want meditation music, like Asian flute music. I love that kind of meditation music if I want to soothe. If I'm in phase 2, I like 80s alternative, right? Because that's music that makes me happy. So I want to engage in that. One of the other things about laughter I recommend is a laugh book. Or that could even just be memes that you download on your phone. But there are things like, there's memes I have downloaded that I just think about them now and they make me want to laugh because they're hilarious. So they're just things that make you laugh every time. So this can be, for some people, maybe watching comedy. It may be reading comedic things like that. So things that we know make us happy. The last one I want to talk about is one that we're going to actually do an exercise with. And we're going to have time to do the exercise because of my adjustments in the PowerPoint. So there are coloring books under here. If you want to grab a coloring book and just pick a page out, it's one that you can
Thank you.
If you want to take a page with you, you can tear out a page. You're going to be able to take it with you. If you want to just color on one that's already there, you can do that too. But again, we're going to follow those same rules. And what we're going to do, so first of all, I'm going to apologize in advance because what I'm going to do is I'm going to trigger you. So sorry about that. But then we're going to find out how easy it is to come out of trigger. So what we're going to do is an exercise. First, what it means to do phase 1 and then move into phase 2. So we're going to have a chance to experientially move through the phases. So, Judy, will you pass that basket over when you're done? No, again, I have one, so whatever you need. Again, we want to make sure we completely fill in the space and try, and we're just going to try and stay within the lines. Also, don't judge how good you're doing it, and don't try and rush. Don't try and worry about finishing right away. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a timer. We're going to be triggered. And then we're going to do a practice. And then we're going to pause and talk about it. And we're going to do 2 minutes at a time with each of these. That's all it really takes. Now, I recommend 20 minutes of practice if you just stay in whatever phase you need to be in until you experience the other state. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But we'll just do, for the sake of time here, we're just going to do 2-minute cycles. So we're going to start. I'm not going to color yet. We're going to start and we're going to trigger first. So again, I apologize for that, but it's going to be, you're going to be appreciate why in the end. So what I want you to do is I want you to think of something in your life that is not working. So something that, it can be something that's always been. It can be something that's new. It can be health related. It can have to do with relationships. It can have to do with finances or work, but something in your life that you're experiencing through a state of suffering. And I want you to just think about that thing. We're just going to go into it for a minute. What is my life? What in my life isn't working? What do I think about that? What kind of thoughts do I have in my head when I think about that thing in my life? How do I feel emotionally? What emotions do I connect with this thing that's not working? Now, I really want you to stop for a minute, connect with your body, your physical body. What are you noticing? Are you tight anywhere? Is there pain or discomfort anywhere? So we're just using awareness. You're not trying to alternate. You're just being aware of it right now. You're not trying to do anything with it, just being aware. What is your physical experience of this suffering? And now what we're going to do is we're just going to color. I'm going to set a timer for 20 minutes, or for not 20 minutes, 2 minutes. And then we're just going to color. So again, just trying to stay within the lines, completely filling the space. we're going to do is we're going to stop for just a minute. And why don't you just go check back in with your body? You notice any difference in how you're physically feeling? Has anything loosened up? Is there any relief to any suffering you might have had? I notice the tightness and then it's gone, where instead, like you said, what you're noticing is the fact that, oh, wait, no, I'm feeling the ease, so I must have been tight. And it was, that's that low level suffering, right? Is where you don't even know, you're suffering until you feel the relief of the suffering. Yeah. Mm-hmm. You might notice too that your thoughts are a little bit different, that the emotions, you might not feel quite as emotional, or the emotions might not be as strong. You say, now what we're going to do is we're going to go into a phase 2 practice that's based in the same, and this is a really powerful practice. This is one of the favorites of the people that do this process. And what we're going to do is we're going to do some more coloring. We're going to do it for another 2 minutes, and we're going to follow the same rules. You want to stay within the lines. Try and stay within the lines. You want to completely fill the space. Again, we're not going to judge it. We're not going to rush. But this time what you're going to do is you're going to do it with your non-dominant hand. So you're going to switch hands, the hand that you're coloring with. And we're going to go for 2 minutes again. Okay, so once again, we're going to stop and just close your eyes. Check in again with your body. Are you noticing any difference in feeling? About your mind, thoughts? Are you having different, is your thinking changed at all? Or your emotional state? That's the amygdala turned off, right? It's one of the things that we really learn as we move into more advanced brain function is there's a huge difference between feeling and emotion. Emotion is the expression of feeling. So feeling is an internal experience, where emotion is an expression of that. And when we're shutting down the amygdala, we're shutting down that implicit emotion. So it can feel kind of foreign in the sense that there's no emotional state to it, but there might be a feeling state. We might become more aware of a certain feeling state. We might be more aware of our body. A lot of people will say, I feel heavier. They're like, it's weird. It's not bad heavy, but I feel heavy, like more present. And I'm like, well, welcome to your body. Our bodies are not light. So being aware of the weight of them means that now my central nervous system is turned on. and I'm aware of the weight of my body, which is not a bad feeling, right? Or it could be a lot of times I'll have people like throughout the meetups, their stomachs are growling and stuff like that because systems are turning on, digestive systems are turning on. It's always a really good idea if you're somewhere and your stomach growls or starts to rumble, because it means you feel safe. It's kicking on. You might experience the absence of thought, because the prefrontal cortex is not thinking. It's taking in information. True mindfulness doesn't think. Thinking processes happen at that primal state, but the actual taking in of information doesn't have thought to it. We're absorbing. It's a different state of consciousness. So could be. Does anybody else have anything that they notice? It was only 2 minutes, so it was a little bit short. I do recommend phase 2 practices for 20 minutes a day. And when it comes to the non-dominant, that's the thing I didn't mention, so you might want to add that to your list. Non-dominant hand use can be anything. It can be locking and unlocking doors. Brushing your teeth is a really intense non-dominant hand experience. You can relearn the alphabet like you learned as a child how to do it with your dominant hand. Some people, if you're ambidextrous, this may not be the best practice for you. I have clients who have used it so much that they are now ambidextrous. So, but initially, the harder it is to do, the better it is for your prefrontal cortex. And that's and they've done tests in neuroscience that activities like mindfulness activities, prefrontal cortex activities, 20 minutes a day actually shrinks the amygdala. So after 5 weeks, they can visibly see the difference in size. So this is huge, because this means a lesser fight or flight response. It's amazing. And the way you experience it in life becomes completely different. So we start to experience these things like a lot of times that I call organic boundaries or organic shifts. So it's kind of like, wow, I always reacted to this before, and today it just didn't bother me. Or people have always gotten away with this with me, and now I don't let them. Now, I do recommend, if you have high fight or flight states, 2 to 3 times a day in the beginning. So the most important time to do these activities is right before you go to sleep. The last 20 minutes, the things we do in the last 20 minutes before we fall asleep are really critical to the brain. We can't enter deep restorative sleep if the brain feels threatened. And if you're going to sleep in a triggered state, your brain feels threatened. So you won't enter those states. And a myriad of things happen in those states that help us be healthy and functioning well. So like literally while you're in bed, non-dominant hand coloring, and then putting it to the side and laying down to go to sleep. You'll sleep better. You'll sleep faster. If you have any insomnia or anything, it will really help with that. And you'll wake up in a better state. I also recommend, if people have high states, right before bed, right when you wake up, you can really set motivation levels for the day by doing an activity like this, and then just sometime during the middle of the day. Okay, so what the body's doing when we enter this state, of course, is at a physical level, we're shrinking that amygdala, which means we're going to minimize our fight or flight response. Our systems are fully engaged. If we turn off that fight or flight response, those systems are going to kick back on fully, so we become healthy and regenerative. We start to cure all those conditions that were listed on that list, right? Because those conditions are only happening because we have histamine imbalance. If we get back into healthy dopamine production, our histamines will go back into balance. At a mental state, we feel successful and valuable, which means we feel clear, centered, and capable. This is the biggest thing, is feeling capable of anything. So no matter what bad thing happens, we are like, well, it's okay. I can handle it because I'm capable, right? We feel confident, self-realized, and we are no longer subject to conditions, external conditions. No longer, the bad thing that happens out here no longer causes us to trigger, because our responses are different. We don't feel threatened by everything anymore. So at an emotional level, we have a low emotional response. We don't feel emotional anymore. We are connected with the feeling body and experiencing this thing they call emotional intelligence. So rather than trying to train in emotional intelligence, it's an inherent byproduct. Expanded thinking, healthy response, being able to see all sides of the equation, things like that are just natural byproducts of shrinking that amygdala. So we're happy, healthy. We have compassion, not empathy, and balance. Empathy's bad. Empathy is where we actually experience emotion with other people. Compassion means I'm aware that you're suffering, but I don't have to suffer with you, right? So this is a thriving state. So just a quick review of phase 2. In phase 2, we're consciously engaging with thoughts, feelings, and emotions in a sense of self. So we're starting to actually be aware of where am I right now, because I've established in phase 1 that wherever I am is a byproduct of chemicals. So now I'm going to be aware of that, and I'm going to be able to enter and maintain a centered a centered state at will. So I'm going to be able to move out of rest and digest and be actually centered and mindful and fully present at will. Which means I'm shrinking the amygdala and breaking the cycle of primal pattern. This is a purely human state, right? Some animals are starting to develop frontal lobes, but the full development of the prefrontal cortex is purely human. So this is the part of the brain we're wanting to engage. There are also a lot of things, and I forgot to mention this, online. Search prefrontal cortex, and you'll find so many ways to stimulate it. Not all work for everyone. You can do binaural music. Some of that stuff just triggers me. So I don't, that doesn't work for me all the time. You have games like Lumosity or Neuronation that are really good. These brain games that are out. There are all sorts of things out there. So the point is not, will it or won't it work for me? It's finding the thing that will work for you. This is why I say I give information on instruction. I'm giving an anatomy lesson. You have to find the thing that's specifically going to work to trigger your prefrontal cortex, right? So again, phase 1, understand that our experience is the byproduct of chemical, not the cause, and to be able to move from fight or flight to rest and digest at will. Phase 2 is working to become more centered. So we're going to control our experience through controlling the chemical. And we're able to move from rest and digest to a state of feeling successful and valuable at will. So again, phase 1 practices are to move us from suffering to feeling safe and well. Phase 2 practices are to move us from feeling safe and well to successful, valuable. What I recommend is go for a phase 2 practice. At least once a day for 20 minutes, 2 to 3 times a day if you experience a lot of suffering. If you can't do the phase 2, return to a phase 1 practice and then try again. If you're in a highly triggered state, do phase 1. The thing I don't want people to do is to use this as a drug to only do practices if you're triggered. You're not going to make very much progress that way. You want to do, so doing phase 2 practices 2 or 3 times a day, you're raising your baseline. Right? So you don't trigger as easily. Those are the ones that are actually shrinking the amygdala. So those are the most important, is the phase 2 practices. The next stage we move into beyond that is where we start to develop advanced brain function, which is innovative and motivated. Striving level. This is the next level for human development. We'll talk about that next week.